I don't really have a way to introduce this matchup because I just think it's a pretty comedic fatal four-way matchup with some of the most obscure characters in professional wrestling fighting for a championship. This matchup took place at Alpha One Wrestling's Crush the Line at Knights of Columbus in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada on December 15, 2019. You might be familiar with some of these characters as we have a four-way elimination match for the Alpha One Zero Gravity Championship with Orange Cassidy being the champion and challenging is Danhausen, Effy, and Dan the Dad. We open on the ring where all three of our challengers have already made their entrance, and as we wait, we see our final competitor and the Alpha One Zero Gravity champion, Orange Cassidy, makes his way to the ring. Fresh off of his AEW debut back in 2019, Cassidy looks to defend the championship in a huge oddball four-way match. Our ring introductions cut off. Love the Dan the Dad character. It's a super gimmick, but the hat, the jorts, and the announcer also wants to know. Danhausen gets introduced with his jar of teeth. Someone in the crowd yells, Orange Cassidy is very happy to be here tonight, it seems like, and the referee takes the belt from Mr. Freshly Squeezed. Everyone gets a look at the belt, Danhausen gives a slight tap, and Effy stretches out the hammies as our referee holds the Zero Gravity Championship up. Dan the Dad hands off his coffee mug to make sure that his son's gift doesn't get destroyed. The bell rings and no one wants to fight besides Dan the Dad. Cass doesn't give a shit, Danhausen is waving to his fanhausens, and Effy continues to stretch. Dan the Dad moves over towards Effy, and apparently Dan's son is in the crowd. Dan the Dad notices Effy's trunks that say daddy, and Dan says, Effy and Dan the Dad look to lock up in the middle of the ring, and then Effy takes Dan the Dad's hand. Dan is not very happy about this because he's married. And then Effy grabs the dad into a waistlock and gives him a little thrust against the ass. The dad backs up into Danhausen's corner, and Danhausen decides I'm gonna have a snack, and then he starts biting Dan the Dad's ear. Danhausen doesn't like the taste of dad. Danhausen moves to the apron to do his signature tequila spot where he just dances to the champ's tequila, but Effy and Danhausen are friends, and Effy joins Danhausen in the dancing as Orange Cassidy takes a swig of his orange juice. Effy and Danhausen get down and funky on the ring apron while Dan the Dad tries to attack them, but Gatanic Panic starts fighting back with some kicks to the instrumental. Dan the Dad steals a microphone and tells them to shut the music off.
Thank God.
Now, boys, I'm not mad, but I am disappointed. You know I have work in the morning. Now you turn down that damn rock and roll music.
Dan the Dad looks to give a whooping because right on cue, he drops Danhausen and Effy face first on the apron by pulling them down on tequila. Dan the Dad now isolates Orange Cassidy, and Orange again says nah and spits the OJ right in Dan's face. Danhausen gets his jar of teeth and then pours it into Dan the Dad's mouth, where Effy then follows up with a pump kick, kicking all of Dan the Dad's teeth out. Effy starts taking my job from me when he says, Danhausen puts Dan's hat on, but then quickly throws it off. Orange Cassidy looks for the pocket spot, but Effy and Danhausen put their hands in his pockets to stop him. They send him off for an Irish whip, but Cassidy just stops in his tracks and holsters his hand in the loose jean pants. He dives over a clothesline and then a double drop kick on Effy and Danhausen, all with his hands in his pockets with signature Orange Cassidy swag. Dan the Dad hops in the ring, stops him, and does the craziest thing ever.
Wait! Got something on your shirt.
Oh! Dan caught him! Orange wasn't even wearing a shirt!
Cassidy takes off his glasses, but then Dan the Dad clocks him with a punch. Dan the Dad grabs Danhausen by the ear, and then he looks to spank Danhausen over his knee. He gives him 10 across the asshausen, and Danhausen is in pain. Effy then takes Danhausen's spot and enthusiastically sacrifices his ass to save Danhausen from more torture. This match has some really funny moments, but that one got the crowd the most, it seems. Effy says, Effy really wants that spank from Dad, but instead he gets Effy by the ear. But then Effy is able to roll him through and smack his ass cheeks into a roll up for a 2 count. Dan the Dad charges at Effy and he flatlines Effy off of the top rope, but he only gets a 2 count again. Dan the Dad takes off his belt, reminding us all of better years in childhood, and as Dan the Dad just wails on the back of Effy with the whipping stick, Danhausen snatches the belt from him, and Dan says,
You give me that damn belt, Danhausen!
but remember with Danhausen,
No swearing!
Danhausen makes him pay for it with a big Northern Lights suplex, Danhausen with an elbow into the corner, and then a rebound German suplex sending Dan the Dad inside out. Danhausen gets that Lovehausen, and Dan the Dad is able to duck under Danhausen, who looks for a butterfly DDT for an inside cradle, and he's able to get the 3 count on Danhausen for the elimination. Effy pops into the ring and nails Dan the Dad with the Rough Rider. Effy with a big boot into the corner, locks his leg around Danhausen's head and gives him a DDT. Definitely one of my favorite moves from Effy. Effy puts on Dan's hat and lifts him up for a suplex, but Dan the Dad with another inside cradle, and another elimination for Dan the Dad. It's down to Dan the Dad and the Zero Grav champion Orange Cassidy. Dan gives Cassidy a big chop, who thinks about it for a second, and then kicks him in the shin. And again. And again. He tries to super kick his ankle, but Dan throws a clothesline. Cass ducks it, and then steps on his white Reeboks. Dan is furious and throws another clothesline, but Cassidy nails the orange punch on Dan the Dad to stagger him. Orange Cassidy then takes Dan around the world with a satellite DDT, but Dan the Dad is still resilient. And as he tries to attempt the suplex, Dan rolls him up for an inside cradle, but gets a 2 count. 2 seconds later, Dan rolls him up again for another inside cradle, but this time he actually gets the 3 count. Dan the Dad just went 3 for 3 with eliminations and has now become the Alpha 1 Zero Gravity champion with an ace up his sleeve. You guys have a random wrestling match or random wrestling oddity you want me to check out? Comment down below.